November 16th, 1532. A dusty plaza high in the Peruvian Andes. On one side, an emperor, Atahualpa, god-king of the largest, richest empire on earth, ringed by 80,000 soldiers. On the other, a Spanish adventurer named Pizarro, with 168 exhausted men, 1,000 miles from help, most of them sick with fear. By sunset, the emperor is in chains. 7,000 of his people lie dead in that square, and not one Spaniard has been killed. How? How does a ragged band of 168 destroy an empire of millions in a single afternoon? Hold on to that question, because the real answer has almost nothing to do with courage or genius or God. It begins 13,000 years earlier with a handful of wild plants. This is guns, germs, and steel. Ask most people why Pizarro won, and the answer comes fast: better weapons. And it's true, the Spanish had steel swords, steel armor, steel-tipped lances against soldiers carrying wooden clubs and quilted padding. They had horses, thundering animals the Incas had never seen. It looked less like a battle than a machine cutting through wheat. But look closer, and the easy answer starts to crack. Guns? Pizarro had maybe a dozen clumsy firearms that took forever to load. At Camarca, they barely mattered. So steel and horses tipped that one afternoon. Yet that only pushes the mystery back a step, because the real question isn't why the Spanish had steel and the Incas didn't. It's why history handed steel to Madrid and not to Cusco. And there was one more weapon in that plaza, one nobody could see. It was already killing the Incas. Years before Pizarro ever reached the Andes, something else had arrived ahead of him. Not a soldier, a disease. Smallpox, carried by Spanish ships to the Americas, had raced overland faster than any horse through peoples who had never seen a European and slammed into the Inca Empire. It killed the reigning emperor. It killed his chosen heir. It threw the whole empire into a civil war that left it split and bleeding. At the exact moment Pizarro walked in, and across 2 American continents, that pattern repeated on a scale almost too vast to feel. Far more native people were killed by invisible germs than by guns and steel put together. So here is the deeper puzzle. Why did the Spanish carry lethal diseases to the Incas, and not the other way around? Why were the deadliest weapons of conquest the ones nobody could even see? Fast forward 4.5 centuries to a beach in New Guinea. A biologist named Jared Diamond is walking the shore with a local politician named Yali, sharp, charismatic, endlessly curious. And Yali asks him a question so simple it lands like a blow. Why is it, he says, that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own? Why do some peoples end up with the ships and the steel and the wealth, and others with so little? For centuries, the West had a ready answer, that some races were simply smarter, more advanced. And that answer isn't just ugly, it's wrong. Diamond would spend the next 30 years proving it wrong. Yali's question became the mystery this entire book sets out to solve. It wasn't the people, it was the place. So if it wasn't intelligence, what was it? Diamond's first move is to split apart 2 kinds of cause: guns, germs, steel, ships. Writing. Those are what he calls the proximate causes. They're the how. They're the weapon in the hand at Cajamarca. But they don't explain themselves. Saying Europe conquered because it had steel is like saying the rich win because they have money. True, and completely unsatisfying. The real question is the ultimate one, buried underneath. Why did steel and germs and writing pile up on one side of the world and not the other? Pull that single thread, and every proximate weapon starts to unravel toward one surprising root. Not a smarter brain, not a stronger God. Something far more ordinary and far more powerful than either. It starts with what a people can eat. Before we chase that root across the whole planet, history offers a cleaner test, an experiment it ran by accident. Around 8 centuries ago, one Polynesian people split in 2. Some settled the warm, fertile islands of New Zealand and became the Maori, dense, farming, warlike, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Others drifted to the cold, barren Chatham Islands and became the Moriori, A few thousand gentle hunter-gatherers who, on thin soil, gave up farming and swore off war entirely. Same ancestors, same genes, a few hundred years apart. Then, in 1835, the Maori found the Chathams. What followed was slaughter. The Moriori, who had renounced fighting, were overwhelmed in days. Two branches of a single family, and their fates were decided not by their blood, but by the islands that had shaped them. Now take that one small experiment and scale it up to 6 continents. Scale it up, and it all comes back to one quiet revolution: food. For most of our history, every human on Earth was a hunter-gatherer, chasing wild animals and gathering wild plants, always moving, never storing much. Then, in a few lucky places, people began to farm, to plant, and harvest, and keep the surplus. And that surplus changed everything. A field feeds far more mouths than a forest ever could, so populations swelled. Stored grain meant some people no longer had to find food at all. They could become full-time soldiers, priests, kings, inventors. Farming didn't just fill stomachs, it built the whole pyramid: dense populations, standing armies, taxes, technology, writing, and packed in close with the animals, disease. Every single item on that list traces back to the plow. So the deepest question in all of human history narrows to this: why did farming begin where it did? Here's the twist most people never expect. Farming was not some obvious idea that clever societies discovered and dim ones missed. Genuine, from-scratch food production, inventing agriculture with no one to copy, happened in stunningly few places on Earth. Maybe 5, perhaps, at the most generous count. 9. The Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. Parts of China, Mexico, the Andes, a single patch of the eastern United States. A tiny short list of cradles, and everywhere else on the planet either learned farming from those centers, or received it thousands of years late, or never got it at all. And the regions that farmed first got a head start measured not in years, but in millennia. So the whole story pivots on one stubborn fact, and it is not about the people at all. It's about what happened to be growing in the ground beneath their feet. Picture 2 hunters, 10,000 years ago, one standing in the Fertile Crescent, one in California. Both are equally clever, equally hungry, equally desperate for an easier life. But one of them is standing in a paradise of future crops, and the other is not. Diamond puts it as a question: when a region never developed farming, was the fault with the people or with the plants available to them? And overwhelmingly, he shows it was the plants. Of all the thousands of wild plant species on Earth, only a tiny handful can ever be turned into reliable crops. The Fertile Crescent happened to hold the jackpot: wild wheat and barley, already nutritious, already easy to harvest and store. California's wild seeds were stubborn, meager, and small. Same human ingenuity, wildly different raw material. And the plants, it turns out, were only half of the lottery. To feel just how thin the margin was, take one plant, the almond. Wild almonds are loaded with cyanide. Bite one, and it can kill you. By every logic, no one should ever eat them. Yet somewhere, someone noticed a rare mutant tree whose nuts weren't bitter, weren't poison, and quietly, with no theory of genetics at all, began saving seeds from only those trees. Do that for enough generations, and the deadly wild almond becomes the harmless snack in your kitchen. That's domestication. Usually not a plan, but an accident, repeated. And it worked beautifully on wheat, on peas, on almonds. But try the same trick on an oak, and you fail every time. Acorns simply refuse to cooperate. So a whole society's fate could hinge on a brutal roll of the dice. Were the plants at your feet the kind that would bend to human hands, or the kind that never would? And then came the animals. Now the animals, and here Diamond borrows a line from Tolstoy: happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Domesticable animals, he says, are all alike. Every undomesticable animal is undomesticable in its own way. To turn a big wild beast into livestock, it has to pass every test at once: eat cheaply, grow fast, breed in captivity, Keep a calm temper, not panic, and accept a human as the boss. Fail even one, and it's hopeless. Of all the large land mammals on Earth, only 14 ever made the cut, and the poster child for failure is the zebra. It looks like a striped horse, but zebras grow vicious with age. They bite and refuse to let go, and they injure more zookeepers every year than tigers do. People tried for centuries to saddle them. The zebra won every time. So where did the lucky 14 actually live? The answer tilts the whole planet. Of the 14 big animals humans ever domesticated, 13 came from Eurasia, sub-Saharan Africa for all its magnificent wildlife. Zebras, giraffes, buffalo gave up, not a single one. The Americas had almost none, because at the end of the last ice age, most of their large mammals had already gone extinct, likely as the first humans arrived. So picture that starting line again. On one continent, wild wheat, plus cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and horses, a ready-made farm. On the others, brilliant people handed a nearly empty toolkit. Nobody chose this. Nobody earned it. It was simply the deal the land dealt, tens of thousands of years before anyone alive could vote on it. It wasn't the people, it was the place. And once that head start existed, geography had one more quiet trick to make it grow. Look at a world map and notice the shape of the continents. The Americas run tall and thin, 9,000 miles from north to south. Africa, much the same, but Eurasia runs the other way. One vast belt stretched east to west. That single difference, Diamond argues, silently rerouted history. A crop bred in the Fertile Crescent could spread west into Europe and east toward India, along the same band of latitude. Same day length, same seasons, same climate, and thrive the entire way. But a crop from Mexico trying to reach the Andes had to cross the burning equator. A llama from Peru could never walk north through the tropics to Mexico, north to south. Every mile fought you, east to west. The door stood open. So Eurasia's inventions, its wheat, its horses, its plows, raced across an entire hemisphere, pooling and combining. On the other continents, the same gifts crawled or died on the road, including the deadliest gift of all. Remember the question, why did the Spanish carry the killer diseases and not the Incas? Here, at last, is the answer, and it is grimly elegant. Nearly every great epidemic disease, smallpox, flu, measles, tuberculosis, plague, did not begin in humans at all. It jumped to us from our animals, from the cattle, the pigs, the ducks we penned up and lived pressed against for thousands of years. Crowd into dense farming towns, packed together with your herds, and you brew the perfect nursery for new plagues, generation after generation. These diseases burned through Eurasian populations, and the survivors passed hard-won resistance down in their blood. The peoples with the most livestock and the densest cities became, without ever knowing it, the deadliest carriers on Earth. The Incas had almost no herd animals, so they had almost none of these diseases and no immunity to them. And now two worlds were about to touch. When they touched, the result was not a war, it was an erasure. As Europeans arrived, the diseases they carried without a thought went ahead of them like a shadow. Whole peoples who never saw a single white face died of smallpox first. In the century or two after Columbus, the native population of the Americas may have collapsed by as much as 95%. 95. Picture a crowded village of 2,000, and then picture 40 survivors wandering the silence. That happened again and again, across two continents. It is tempting to imagine the conquest as brave soldiers and brilliant generals. Mostly, it was microbes, an accidental weapon, forged over 10,000 years in the barns of the old world, and unleashed on people with no defense. The guns and the steel only finished a job the germs had already begun, but conquest needed more than a weapon. It also needed a way to remember. It needed writing. When Pizarro sailed for Peru, he was not guessing. He carried centuries of written knowledge, maps, and histories, and detailed reports of how another conquistador had toppled the Aztec Empire the very same way. Atahualpa, by contrast, had never even heard of Spain until the strangers were standing inside his kingdom. One side could store and ship information across oceans and generations. The other could not. And writing, like farming, was almost never invented from scratch. It seems to have been born on its own only a handful of times, always in those same early farming heartlands, where crowded societies needed to tax and track and command. Everyone else borrowed it or copied the idea. So the head start compounded yet again. The peoples who farmed first wrote first, and the ones who could write could plan a conquest the way you would plan a harvest. Which brings us to one more piece of the machine: the tools themselves. We love to picture invention as a lone genius struck by lightning, the flash of need, and then the brilliant answer. Diamond flips it around. Invention, he argues, is more often the mother of necessity than the other way around. People tinker and stumble onto something first, and only later does the world discover a use for it. Edison built the phonograph convinced it was for recording dying people's last words. It took others to imagine music. But here is what matters for our story. Technology feeds on itself, and it feeds on numbers. The more people packed together, and the more societies connected enough to trade ideas, the faster inventions pile onto inventions. A large, dense, well-linked Eurasia was an engine for exactly that. A thin, divided, isolated continent was not. Once again, the same root, food, density, connection, quietly decides who ends up with the tools. And tools, plus food, build something bigger still: power itself. Follow the surplus far enough, and you arrive at the state. A band of a few dozen hunter-gatherers needs no king. Everyone knows everyone, and food is simply shared. But pour in stored grain in swelling numbers, and something has to organize it all. So bands become tribes. Tribes become chiefdoms, and chiefdoms harden into kingdoms with rulers, soldiers, tax collectors, and priests. Diamond is blunt about the bargain. Every centralized state is, in part, a kind of licensed robbery, siphoning wealth from the many toward the few. What keeps it from collapsing is an idea, religion, and shared belief, which turns raw force into rightful authority and makes people march and die for a king they will never meet. That is what truly stood behind Pizarro in that plaza. Not just one bold man, but an entire machine of church and crown and steel. Atahualpa led a state too, but two states, born of two very different lands, had grown wildly unequal. Which brings us back, at last, to Yali and to New Guinea. Because Diamond's own answer to Yali is not a compliment wrapped in geography, it is sharper than that. He spent decades among New Guineans and came to believe they are, if anything, quicker and more curious than the average Westerner minds, sharpened by a world where a moment's inattention can kill you. So why so little cargo? Look again at the hand the land dealt them. New Guinea's people farmed. They invented agriculture entirely on their own, but from a poor local pantry. No wheat, no rich grains, and not one large animal to tame for meat or muscle. Australia's first peoples faced soils and droughts so harsh that farming barely worked at all. Give the world's most brilliant people a barren toolkit and a locked door, and their genius has nowhere to compound. The cargo never came, because the crops and the creatures never did. And once you see the pattern, you start to see it running everywhere, like a hidden law. China did not begin as one people. It was once a patchwork of tribes and tongues. But an early farming heartland let one group's crops and language and army spread until a whole subcontinent became, in a single word, Chinese. In Africa, a people called the Bantu, armed with iron and their own crops, swept out of one small region and across half the continent, absorbing or displacing the hunter-gatherers in their path. The very same engine that fired at Cajamarca, only aimed in a different direction. Over and over, the farmers with the fuller toolkit expanded, and the peoples without it receded. It was never a story about which race was superior. It was always a story about who inherited the richer land, and what that inheritance, compounded across 10,000 years, would finally grow into. So return one final time to that plaza at Cajamarca and watch the mystery dissolve. Pizarro's steel was forged from ore mined by a society rich enough to feed full-time smiths. His diseases had been bred over 10,000 years in European barns. His written orders carried the memory of every conquest that came before him. The ships that brought him, the state that funded him, the horses that shattered the Inca line. Every last one was the far end of a chain that began with wild wheat and a tamed sheep in a valley half a world away. Atahualpa had lost before he was ever born. Not because his people were lesser, they built roads and cities that left the Spanish stunned, but because their continent had handed them a thinner deck and the game had been running for millennia. The 168 did not defeat an empire. Geography did. It simply wore their armor that afternoon. Now, a moment of honesty, the kind Diamond himself insists on. This is a bold theory, and even he warns you not to swallow it whole. History, he admits, is not a laboratory. You cannot rerun the centuries to check your answer. Geography, he argues, sets the broad stage, but it does not script every scene. Culture is a wild card. A quirk of religion, or writing, or habit can send two similar lands in completely different directions. So are individuals, a single stubborn leader, one lucky accident, and the story bends. Diamond is careful to say he can explain the great sweep of human history, the grand pattern across continents and millennia, but not why any one nation rose in any one century. Critics have pushed hard on exactly those edges, and that argument is far from settled. A great idea doesn't ask for your faith. It asks you to keep questioning it, especially this one. Because there is a way to hear this whole theory wrong, and it matters enormously. If geography handed Europe its guns and germs, does that mean the conquest was destiny? That the winners deserve to win? Diamond's answer is a flat, urgent no. Explaining why something happened is not the same as excusing it. Understanding how a crime was committed is exactly what lets us refuse to repeat it. The entire purpose of this book is to demolish the oldest, ugliest explanation of all, that some peoples came to dominate because they were born superior. That story wasn't only cruel, it was false. The real engine was never in anyone's blood. It was in the soil, the seeds, the animals, the shape of the continents, accidents of geography that no people chose and no people earned. Which leaves us finally with the answer to Yali. And it is the exact opposite of what the conquerors believed. So, why do some peoples end up with so much cargo and others with so little? Not because of anything in the people, because of everything in the place. Strip away 13,000 years, and you find no master race and no chosen tribe. Only a scatter of humans, equally clever, equally striving, set down on wildly unequal ground. Some stood where the wheat grew thick, and the animals could be tamed, and the continent ran east to west. Others were handed poison almonds, wild zebras, and a locked north-south road. Everything that followed, the farms, the germs, the writing, the states, the ships riding in the harbor at Cajamarca, grew out of that first, unchosen difference in the land. The weight of where you began, Diamond writes, still lies heavily on all of us. It wasn't the people, it was the place. It always was. Which leaves one last thought to carry out of here. We look at the modern world, its winners and its losers, its rich nations and its poor. And it feels so natural to assume the map was always meant to look this way. That someone earned the top, and someone deserved the bottom. Guns, germs, and steel takes that assumption and gently turns it over to show the accident hiding underneath. Change the seeds, the animals, the shape of the land, and the entire map of power redraws itself. The same human beings, a different roll of the dice. That is the idea worth carrying with you. Before you judge where anyone ended up, first look hard at where they were made to start. And if you found that as unsettling as we did, there's a natural next question. Not how great societies rise, but why, at the very height of their power, some of them choose to fall. That's the one we'll open next. Until then, keep questioning the map.